Tonight, the biggest day yet in the US election calendar. People in 15 states are voting from the east to the west coast. Migration, old age, wars. What will be the key deciding factors in this election? We'll be live across the country in this race for the White House to find out what voters care about most. There'll be criminal trials on Donald Trump's campaign calendar, but he's still boasting that he'll win every state this time round.
Donald Trump, he puts on his helmet and goes charging at it.
Many who voted for Joe Biden 4 years ago are worried about his advancing age. Could those concerns dictate who becomes president?
That age is a grandpa's age.
Not the future president's age.
No.
Reproductive rights are back in the election spotlight too. Could they be a political liability for the Republican Party? After an Alabama court ruled that frozen embryos were human children, we'll assess how that could affect women going through IVF. Plus, is it time to pay up and say sorry for slavery? I'll put that question to a reparations campaigner and the descendants of slave owners. That's all coming up on The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Good evening. 15 states, 1 US territory, millions choosing their preferred candidate to be president. It's called Super Tuesday, a crucial moment in the US election cycle. This time round, it won't be so super, though. That's because it's becoming increasingly clear who will take part in that final race to the White House. It'll almost certainly be a rematch of Donald Trump versus Joe Biden. Both men are trying to woo an exhausted electorate, worried about huge issues like immigration and the cost of living. Foreign policy could play a big part too. America is heavily involved in 2 wars in Ukraine and in Gaza. Whoever becomes president could influence what happens on those battlefields. That's why the world is keeping an eye on the decisions being made today in states like California to Maine. Coming up, we'll hear from voters and our correspondents across the country. But let's get started with tonight's first report from James Matthews in North Carolina.
If Nikki Haley is left behind after today, Biden versus Trump is the race on the horizon. One that will turn on who wins here, in North Carolina and half a dozen swing states like it.
Terrible decisions, terrible leader.
Biden's opponents didn't miss a recent poll that showed most of his supporters think him too old to be effective.
Half the time he doesn't even know where he's at. So, how does somebody like that lead the country?
Macy, come.
He's old as dirt, and I think he's ruining this country.
Immigration, the economy and foreign wars are themes to roll through the campaign. Abortion is an election issue like never before. Republican-driven restrictions on access have handed Democrats votes they didn't previously have.
Cookies and cream, chocolate, and cinnamon toast crunch.
Thank you so much.
In North Carolina, we went to the Wilmington Women's Market.
Thank you so much.
With restrictions now casting doubt over IVF treatment, it's an issue threaded through politics here.
For me, that's definitely a deciding factor, and it's something that I've kind of been paying close attention to, especially when it comes to IVF. I definitely am kind of looking around different states, seeing what they're doing. I think things kind of start in pockets and then tend to spread.
Reproductive rights should be personal in the home and made a decision between the individuals involved and the doctor involved, not a bunch of male politicians sitting in their respective houses.
It makes a difference to me if there's someone going into the office that says we all should be able to have abortions. They're completely open to it. Yeah, they would not get my vote.
Why is that?
Because, again, they're narrow-minded on the issue, and they want everything to be okay. Not everything is okay. We have to have some guidelines. We have to have rules.
Thanks for coming out and voting today.
Listen, I wouldn't have missed it for the world.
Amen. That's right.
This was Super Tuesday voting at Rockingham in North Carolina.
Hey, ma'am, how are you?
It's solid Trump country, and it shows. What about Nikki Haley? Is she not the answer?
She doesn't ring my bell, that's all. She just doesn't have what it takes, I think. She's going to be too much of a pushover for world affairs. Donald Trump, he puts on his helmet and goes charging at it.
I don't vote for women in big positions.
Why?
because I believe the Bible, a man should be over a woman.
Men should be in the booth.
Nikki Haley says she'll remain in this contest as long as she stays competitive. That may not be for much longer. The polls tell us that Super Tuesday will supercharge Donald Trump's status as the would-be Republican nominee. On a day for mapping out America's election road trip, we crossed the state line. This was Jam Night in Ferrum, Virginia. Different vibe, different voices.
I am a part of the LGBTQ plus community, and I just want to feel safe.
It seems like this country is going more to extremes on either side, to the left and to the right.
I have no idea who I'm going to vote for. Someone that'll keep me safe.
And do you think either man can?
No.
Why?
I think Donald Trump disrespects women, and Joe Biden is not in control of the country.
The sound of Trump versus Biden isn't what this country wants to hear. Polls consistently reflect their unpopularity. It is the shape of an election campaign to come. Political trench warfare that America doesn't need, with personnel it doesn't want.
We have correspondents across the United States tonight. Martha Kellner is in California, Mark Stone is at the US Supreme Court, and James Matthews is in North Carolina. Let's go straight to James first. And James, this Super Tuesday has felt like a bit of an anticlimax, but it's still important.
Exactly, Yalda. Yeah, it's a huge day in the political calendar, but, you know, a bit of... There's certainly less excitement than there normally is in any other election year because Joe Biden is a shoo-in on the Democratic side. We have a contest of sorts on the Republican side, but it's a contest in name only because of the distance between Donald Trump and his would-be challenger, Nikki Haley. On Super Tuesday, we have 16 U.S. states and 1 U.S. territory voting for who they want to see as their parties pick to contest the presidential race in November. It's about carrying forward delegates to the party conventions in the summer. Right now, Donald Trump, as we speak, is on 273. Nikki Haley is only on 43 delegates. So that gives you an idea of the scale of the challenge that Nikki Haley faces. And for all the talk about her continuing in this race, her current thinking is that she will stay in it as long as she remains competitive. Well, the big question is how long will that be, given the distance between Trump and Haley and given the likelihood, say the polls, that that distance will increase tonight?
James, thank you so much for that update there from North Carolina. Let's go to Martha now. And Martha, so many big issues there that the Republican Party is dealing with. But for the Democrats, the focus has been on those low approval ratings for Joe Biden, as well as his age.
Yeah, it has. I think, Yalda, many people here, I'm in California, a deep blue state, they're seeing Super Tuesday really as firing the starting gun for the presidential election. And speaking to people, one of their major concerns at the moment is President Biden's age. He is 81 years old. By the end of a possible second term, he would be 86 years old. And the scrutiny on his advanced years has increased in recent months. There was that special counsel report, which I'm sure people will remember, where President Biden was described by the special counsel as being a well-meaning but elderly man. It was also claimed that he forgot the date of his own son's death, that he forgot the dates of his vice presidency. So it's been a damaging few months in that sense. And more bad news for President Biden's re-election campaign in recent polling that's emerged, polling from the New York Times and Siena College. The most striking finding, and these were interviews of people who voted for President Biden in 2020, so 4 years ago. That polling found that 61% of those people who voted for Biden in 2020 say that they now think he's just too old to be an effective president. A good number of those were even more worried. 19% of those who voted for him in 2020 said that his age was now such a problem that he was no longer capable of handling the job. So incredibly worrying for him and his team as they plot a path to an election victory over Donald Trump. And those figures are even more stark when you take into consideration independent and Republican voters too.
Martha, you've been there now for the last few days. What have voters been telling you?
So I've been speaking mainly to traditional Democrat voters, and they're telling me that they are worried about President Biden's age. They're also worried about his foreign policy handling. The war of Gaza is a particular concern to some Arab American and younger voters here. Many of them saying that they will be looking at lodging possible protest votes against President Biden. Very few of them saying that they're going to swing so far as to vote for Donald Trump in November, but certainly a lot of them looking at protest votes, some of them also looking at possible independent candidates, the likes of Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is running for the presidency as well. So I think we can listen now to what some of those Democrat voters had to say about President Biden's age. It's likely to be the oldest head-to-head in history.
Yeah, it's very disappointing to see that that's what we've come to. Yeah.
Are you surprised that there's not an alternative to President Biden, a younger option?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it would be exciting to see someone that the Democratic Party could get behind and be excited about, but we don't have that, unfortunately. And right now they're making a mess of everything from a foreign policy perspective, from a domestic perspective, everything.
Will President Biden's age stop you voting for him in November? Will something else stop you voting for him?
I mean, the Gaza issue is a big one. I think that the U.S. should call for an immediate ceasefire.
When you're bringing up one age, you've got to bring up both ages. So is it a concern? Yes. But it's also a concern that the other party is also of age, and neither of them really should be running at this time.
Do you think he's still got it?
Yes, and I think he's surrounded himself with a lot of very smart people and people who are energetic and enthusiastic and capable of providing proper assistance. And that's all we can ask from anyone, and it's not about age. I've known school principals who were in their 40s and they were idiots.
He's very competent and he has trouble walking. Other than that, he's a good choice.
Do you think in 4 years' time he will still be capable of being the leader of the free world?
I do, and I think he has good people working with him, and there shouldn't be a problem.
That age is a grandpa's age.
Not the future president's age?
No.
They were some Democratic voters speaking to our Martha Kellner. Let's speak to Mark Stone now. And Mark, we're just hearing there about some of the problems that President Biden is facing with voters, and Donald Trump has his fair share of problems too.
He really does. What a remarkable election year it is for America. Yes, Super Tuesday itself may not be all that exciting. It may be a slam dunk for Trump, but take a step back and look at where we are. Two very elderly white men running for president. Both have been president before. Two men who most people don't seem to want. One man is in his 80s and is consistently criticized for being too old, as you just heard there. And the other one is facing an unprecedented series of court cases. I mean, it's quite remarkable. We're going to be here at this building, the Supreme Court, so many times over the course of the next few months. 91 criminal charges against him. That's made up from 2 state cases, 2 federal cases. And all of those 4 are set to go ahead at some point. We've got the hush money case up in New York. That is a case against Donald Trump for allegedly paying money to a porn star. That is a state-level case in New York. It potentially, if he's found guilty, there is a prison sentence for that. That's the first one due, perhaps at the end of this month, almost certainly at the end of this month. Then there's the secret documents case. That's down in Florida. That is for Trump allegedly holding secret documents at his Mar-a-Lago mansion. That is a big case too. Perhaps that will go ahead in July or August, maybe not. Again, if he's found guilty, potentially a jail term for him. Then the election interference case in Georgia, a state-level case. No date for that at the moment. Lots of legal arguments going on there. And then the most serious one, the one that relates to alleged crimes that took place here in Washington, D.C., a federal case for election subversion. insurrection and Donald Trump's involvement in the January the 6th protests 2021. Were they protests? Were they riots? Was it an insurrection? That is a massive case indeed, and it has been pushed far to the right because the Supreme Court, the 9 justices in that building behind me, will make a decision as to whether or not a president is immune from prosecution. If they decide a president is immune from prosecution, well, then all the cases go away. That would be utterly remarkable. It's unlikely. But you could be sure, Yalda, that the campaign trail for Donald Trump is the courtroom, and he's making the most of it.
Yeah, and Mark, I guess everything you've sort of laid out there, it hasn't really put off voters.
No, absolutely not. You know, if anyone had been standing, you know, reflecting or looking forward to the election a few years ago, they would have said, indeed they did say, there's no chance that he could be the candidate with so much baggage. And then on top of all that baggage that we know from the last election, all those court cases again. But people underestimate or misunderstand what a proportion of Americans believe. And either they see these court cases as part of a witch hunt, as he has said all along, or they see beyond them and they don't believe he is guilty. They believe he will be acquitted from all of them. And for them, he is their street fighter, and they will vote for him. I guess you could say, Martha, Yalda, that Trump voters fall into several different categories. That clearly, or Republicans, I should say, clearly there are those that are absolutely committed to him. There is an undecided group who would like someone else, but there isn't anyone, and so in November they will probably vote for him. And then there are the never-Trumpers. They're always there, but how many of them are there these days?
Mark, thank you so much for all of your analysis there. Joining us now from New York is Ian Bremmer, American political scientist and author. Ian, good to see you. What are some of the things that you're looking at right now?
Well, I think the most important point, especially from the perspective of American allies, is that U.S. democracy is in crisis. In any functional advanced industrial democracy, if you have a former president running that tried to do everything in his power to subvert the outcome of the last election, which is the bedrock of allowing a democracy to work properly, and that isn't the top issue that everyone is discussing, you've got a very serious problem. And that is exactly what you've just heard. You've heard it from the voters. You've heard it from your analysts. We see it in the media headlines every day. People are talking about most things other than the fact that Trump fundamentally wants to subvert democracy. That is a sign that U.S. democracy is in very serious trouble. He could very easily win.
I mean,
he will certainly get the nomination.
If I listen to your analysis, this is very similar analysis to 2016. You predicted, A, he wouldn't win, and B, it would be more or less catastrophic.
2020, I think, is the more significant challenge, of course, where he did not win, and he did everything in his power to try to overturn it. And we saw what happened in January 6th. There's no question that people were very surprised, myself included, that Trump actually did pull it out in 2016. It was very, very close. All U.S. elections at this point are very, very close because there are almost no districts that are clear red or clear blue. So you're fighting over a very small number of districts in a very small number of states. But again, what we've seen over the course of the last 8 years, whether it's under Obama, under Trump, under Biden, is that Americans' belief in the legitimacy of U.S. institutions has continued to deteriorate. You see that in the numbers for the Supreme Court and for the legislature, for the executive. You also see it in numbers on American views of mainstream media, of the church. It is really difficult to run a functional democracy when people don't believe in the system and aren't able to have the same conversation with each other. So that erosion is unquestionable, and it's radically different than you're seeing. I mean, Brexit you had in the UK didn't have any impact on the functioning of rule of law in that country. Even in Brazil, which was closest to what was experienced in the United States, the Brazilian government made it impossible, the Supreme Court made it impossible for Bolsonaro to run again in the next election. It looks like he's likely to be sent to jail. The United States is not in that position right now.
OK, we'll keep you right there, Ian. I'm going to bring in our panellists for tonight, founder of Basement Films and former editor of Channel 4 News, Ben DePere, and journalist Laura Trevelyan. Good to see you both. Laura, I'm going to come to you first. We hear this a lot. American democracy is in crisis. You know, things are looking bad. Is it as catastrophic as Ian and some others are saying?
Well, speaking as someone who's British and American, speaking as someone who was on the steps of the US Capitol in 2021 on January the 6th, and as someone who was actually sworn in as an American citizen the day after Donald Trump was elected, I take a slightly more robust view of things in that it's a participatory democracy. People have been turning out. If you look at the impact of Roe versus Wade, for example, overturning what was a constitutional right to abortion, the US Supreme Court, justices appointed by Donald Trump essentially did that. That has driven up turnout amongst young women. And that has helped Democrats in national elections since that happened. And it'll be very interesting, for example, to see the impact of Roe versus Wade on this year's election, particularly, as one of your correspondents was saying, since that ruling in Alabama, where essentially all IVF treatment is on hold because of the fear that doctors could be prosecuted because of the idea that, an egg is actually a person. So I am not so much of a doom merchant as Ian is. I think it's going to be a very close, very competitive election. People seem to have forgiven or forgotten Donald Trump's actions on January the 6th. They don't like Joe Biden because he's so old. But it's going to be, I think, a very exciting and consequential election.
Ben, I want to bring you in. Thoughts?
I think the election, I feel Donald Trump will win. I think that Biden is too old. I think he's going to have some sort of fall, or there's going to be some sort of moment. He'll lose the support he's got. The election's on a knife edge. But what I really fear is that American democracy with Donald Trump 2.0. What happens when he gets in, having been stymied the first time with people, grown-ups in the room who would stop him making rash decisions, military figures from the Pentagon who were deliberately trying to avoid him attacking Iran in the last few weeks of his presidency. He seems to be preparing a new team that will try and distort the democratic levers he has and the democratic limitations he has on him, and put a new team in.
Is there no
which will make
faith
it Trump.
in sort of American institutions? Is the bumper sticker that it could be tragic but not catastrophic?
Again, I think it can be overstated. For example, you would think that no Republicans would even believe in voting if they believed that the 2020 election was stolen from them. Yet they do believe, and they will turn out in December. So I think there's an element in American politics that is performative, and Donald Trump really sums that up. And this idea that you take him not exactly literally. People who like Donald Trump enjoy the fact that he's a showman. They don't take it entirely seriously. They seem to have even forgiven January the 6th, extraordinary as that might seem. So, I'm of the view that things are not as bad as everyone else makes out. I know that sounds a little Pollyanna-ish.
Not yet.
Indeed, not yet.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to bring in Ian. Ian, you're listening to our panellists. We've been talking a lot about domestic issues in the United States and how the two leaders are viewed. But foreign policy will also play a big role, especially when it comes to Ukraine, Gaza. We saw the uncommitted voters in Michigan, for example. We're expecting a similar sort of thing to happen in Minnesota.
Well, first of all, I think your panelists are very reasonable. We're not talking about the U.S. devolving into civil war or becoming an authoritarian regime. What we're talking about is a hit to rule of law that will matter. It will matter domestically for a long term. It will matter to U.S. allies abroad. That is the issue, because if Trump wins, he has to undo all of the cases against him, and he will go after his political enemies by politicizing the Department of Justice, the FBI, the IRS. That's unprecedented, but it doesn't mean the United States is Russia. Doesn't even mean it's Turkey or Hungary. But it is not the U.S. that allies are used to dealing with. Now, from a foreign policy perspective, a Trump win, and I don't have a crystal ball. I think that Biden can still win. I think certainly if the election were today, Biden would lose, but it's close. It's very close. So it could go either way. But if Trump does win, set against a context of a world where two major wars are going on, there's a lot of geopolitical instability, not what he was dealing with in Trump 1.0. You will have more extreme...
Well, I want to push you on that, because let's talk about sort of Biden's track record on this, whether it's come to Gaza. Even Ukraine and the bill, he's turned the border issue into his own issue now. And we saw the split screen with Trump and Biden, on the border just last week. He hasn't necessarily handled the crisis in Gaza well.
I wasn't suggesting that, Yalda. You didn't let me finish. I'm sorry. I know we've got to be quick here. But I mean, look, Trump had plenty of wins when he was president. Look at USMCA. Certainly look at the fact that NATO allies paid a lot more for the defense. Look at the Abraham Accords. Even look when he whacked the Iranians really hard with the killing of Soleimani, and then the Iranians backed down. It's not as if Biden is the only person that can succeed at foreign policy and everything Trump does is bad. The point is that you will have more extreme outcomes under Trump, some of which will be good, some of which will be bad. And the question is, how lucky do you feel? For if he wants to end the war in Ukraine, he can easily shut it down by taking away all the support that Zelensky and his government, his military gets. The question is, will that lead to a major schism among NATO allies and the EU, with some turning to the U.S., some not? He wants to put 60% tariffs on all Chinese exports to the U.S. Chinese economy isn't doing so well right now. Could lead to tit-for-tat economic warfare between the two countries. Could lead the Chinese to blink and say, we can't handle this. The Americans are too strong. We're going to have to cut a deal with Trump. Trump could look like a genius because he's sitting there with the most powerful country and he's willing to throw his chips around. But he could also fail in some things. And it's a much more dangerous environment. So the point is, the status quo will not hold. It's going to be much more extreme outcomes, good and bad, in foreign policy crises. And I do mean crises around the world.
Well, we'll be watching closely, and we will keep you there, Ian, because we will be coming back to you a little later in the programme. But let's go back to our correspondents and get a sense from them about everything they've heard from the panellists as well as from Ian. Let's go to James first. James.
Hi, Yalda. Yeah, in the past couple of days, I've been in Virginia. I'm standing here in North Carolina, speaking to people. The economy, I would say, is top of the list in terms of what they regard as the top priority. Yes, inflation's down here, unemployment's down, the economy is on its way back, and Biden has avoided a recession. But people are saying, look, prices are sky high. Gas prices are high. Shopping bills are sky high. So that's a big one. The border, immigration, a big issue. But on the issue of Trump, can I say one thing, Yalda? It is interesting, and I can see why people say he will win the election because he's ahead in the polls. See, when you try to interview people about Donald Trump, they take a step back. They don't want to get involved. They'll talk to you about Democrats all day. Trump supporters will trumpet their support from the rooftops for him. But anti-Trump individuals and voters, they don't want to get involved because, I think, of the febrile nature of politics here. It's divisive, polarised. The question is, how big is that silent majority come November?
James, really fascinating. Mark, I'm going to come to you.
Yeah, well, I thought what Laura said was very interesting just then, and I'm inclined to agree. I mean, you can take a fatalist view of what a second Trump term might look like, because he won't be surrounded by the so-called adults in the room, as people like to say. He will handpick people who are very, very friendly to him, but maybe that's right. Maybe it will be an absolute disaster. But remember, he likes to be a winner, not a loser. I think the idea of him burning the house down is very unlikely in a second term. What I think is more likely is errors, is mistakes in terms of international geopolitics, which then inflame things. That, I think, potentially is a real danger. It's interesting, Yalda, if you speak to people close to Trump's circle behind the scenes, as I do, they sound more reasonable than Trump does when he's on the campaign trail. He knows he needs to push that rhetoric, to make it fiery, because he knows his base is so important. Behind the scenes, maybe it is just that bit slightly more measured. We'll see.
Mark, thank you. And let's get some thoughts now from Martha.
Yeah, I think, Yalda, voters are now resigned to the fact that this election is going to be a battle of the old age pensioners, and I think age will play into it. It was interesting what Ben said there about the possibility of President Biden doing something like falling off stage. There is always the capacity in this election campaign for a catastrophic event to hit either man. I think interesting today will be to watch out for the turnout. President Biden is basically unopposed for the Democratic nomination, but it will be interesting to see how many of his voters turn out. And there are also uncommitted options on some of the ballots in some of the states. So it'll be interesting to see if there is any protest vote against President Biden, either because of his age or because of his handling of the situation in Gaza.
Martha, thank you, and thank you to our correspondents as well as our panellists. We will be keeping our panellists here for more on the US election. You're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still to come, who's doing the best job of appealing to female voters? We look at some of the key issues dominating the political agenda, including reproductive rights. And what does the choice of music by presidential candidates say about them? Find out after the break.
They have breached the road. There is a lot of gas being fired all around us. It is an absolute carnival kind of atmosphere out here for Prime Minister Modi's decisive victory. These students are defying the prohibitory order, and now they're going to be arrested. We aim to be the best and most trusted place for news. The roads have been inundated. The only way out is to get people by boat. This on any given day would have been bustling with people, but today it's absolutely deserted. I'm Neville Lazarus, and I'm Sky's reporter based in Delhi.
Welcome back. We're going to stay with the US election and consider how the contest might impact women's rights. In Alabama, where abortion is illegal, a new Supreme Court ruling is causing families some major concern. That's after the court equated frozen embryos with children. The consequence, major IVF providers paused their services out of fear of being sued. There are now efforts to protect them, but the future remains somewhat uncertain. Well, let's bring in Laura and Ben into the conversation. Laura, reproductive rights always such a major issue in US politics.
Well, and this time it's huge, especially for Donald Trump, because he can't, it seems, make up his mind whether he's pleased that he's the person who can claim victory for the Supreme Court having overturned Roe versus Wade, the constitutional right to an abortion, or whether he wants to run from the hills from that decision. It really seems to depend which audience he's addressing. But come if, as we expect, he's the Republican nominee, he won't be able to escape from that one. And the New York Times reported that privately he would actually like a 16-week national ban on abortion. But, of course, that's not what the religious right wants. They want a total ban with no exceptions, even for rape or incest. So it's a very tricky one for Donald Trump and for Republicans in general come November.
Yeah, and Democrats are jumping on this, sort of saying, you know, first it was abortion, now IVF, next they'll come after birth control.
It's extraordinary how moral issues become binary sort of political issues in America, and that's one of the things I think we look at from outside. France the other day made abortion a constitutional issue, and yet America continually wrestles with problems which are religious or personal morality or even family problems. And it's extraordinary that it finds a way to divide itself on every single issue. This issue's been a point of contention for decades now in America, and it doesn't seem to resolve itself, and it just gets kicked from one side to the other.
And yet IVF is extremely popular amongst a majority of Americans, a clear majority. It's really just a very small majority that believes that in some way this is an actual threat to life, IVF, which is why it's another albatross for Donald Trump and why Republicans in general are running away from that court decision down in Alabama, because women want to have the ability to have children when they're older. Younger women are freezing eggs. So this is another opportunity for Democrats to paint Republicans as being like something out of The Handmaid's Tale.
And as you say, a major sort of talking point, and continues to be. Now, this is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, should the king say sorry over slavery? We hear from the Caribbean nations wanting reparations over the royals' ancestral links to the slave trade. Welcome back. Should the king say sorry for his ancestral involvement in slavery? Caribbean nations say now is the time for a royal apology. Charles has previously expressed his personal sorrow at the suffering of so many, but stopped short of the word sorry. Could things be about to change? Here's our royal correspondent, Laura Bundock.
Should the king say sorry for slavery? During recent royal tours of the Caribbean, demonstrations directed at the Crown, with increasing demands for an apology.
He is the single most important person in this process. And I think now is the time, given all that's happening globally with terms of justice, Black Lives Matter, human rights, that it's an appropriate thing for him to do and the right thing for him to do.
The British monarchy's involvement in the transatlantic slave trade is well documented. Charles II founded the Royal African Company, one of the biggest slave trading businesses. Years later, William of Orange was gifted £1,000 of shares in the company by the notorious Edward Colston, whose statue was recently torn down. Archives also show links through Edward Porteous from the Bowes-Lyon family, ancestors of the late Queen Mother. Senior royals haven't stayed silent about slavery.
I want to express my profound sorrow. Slavery was abhorrent.
But they've stopped short of an apology.
I cannot describe the depths of my personal sorrow at the suffering of so many.
Some aristocratic families, including the Trevelyan's, have said sorry.
To the people of Grenada, we, the undersigned, write to apologise.
Laura Trevelyan says it's now the King's turn.
I would hope that the King would do something to make up for the fact that his ancestors sanctioned the slave trade in people at the very beginning. And because he's the King of England, one of the most followed monarchies in the entire world, anything that he does will be hugely significant.
Last year, when the Dutch king said sorry, there were celebrations. We're told slavery is an issue King Charles takes profoundly seriously. He's backing research into the Crown's connection with the slave trade. But for many, that's not enough. They want him to take action for the actions of his ancestors. The King now has a decision whether to answer the growing calls for an apology and reparations. Laura Bundock, Sky News.
Well, joining me now is Ali Gill, chairman of the Grenada National Reparations Committee and a member of the CARICOM Reparations Commission. Thank you, sir, for joining us here on the programme. I guess it's the big question, isn't it? Should the king apologise?
The question may properly be framed why the king is taking so long. He has expressed his profound personal sorrow. He has expressed regret. We would love for him now to elevate that profound personal sorrow and regret into an apology and to say sorry and to make reparations for the harm that was caused. After all, the British monarchy has invested tremendously in the Atlantic slave trade and slavery. They have profited massively from their investments that they have made. And in many ways, they have governed, they have sanctioned the slave trade and slavery, and they have benefited directly. So we believe that the time is nigh for the British monarchy and the king, who has come close. In recent times, the royal archives have been opened for research and so forth. Therefore, the time is nigh for him now to make a formal apology to us.
Yeah, I mean, you say you want an apology. You're saying, why is it taking so long? Why do you think it hasn't happened yet?
The monarchy will be in a much better position than I am to say why it hasn't happened as yet. But one will believe that the British society, the British government, maybe they are fearful with regards to the call or the demand for reparations with regards to the compensation that ought rightfully to be made to the descendants of slaves and for the persons who descended from the indigenous population in the Caribbean. So I cannot speak comfortably with regards to the reason why the British monarchy is taking so long. But just to say that it will be the right thing. We have witnessed recently the Church of England is taking these bold steps. We believe that they must do more with regards to the engagement with those of us who are championing the cause of reparations. But if the church is doing it, the king must do it, and certainly the Prime Minister and the government of England should follow suit. They should not, the Dutch has led the way, but the English, for us here in the Caribbean, they were the most dominant colonial power.
Yeah.
And as such, an apology will be far more reaching coming from the King of England.
Ali Gill, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us here on the programme.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to bring in Laura Trevelyan as well as Ben de Peer. I mean, Laura, your family, you have done so much around this. Just tell us a little bit more about what you're doing and what you're working on.
Yeah, well, essentially, I'm descended from enslavers in the British Caribbean, something that was not known by my generation or my father's, but thanks to the University College London database of the compensation that was paid actually to slave owners when slavery was abolished in 1834, we discovered that our ancestors got the equivalent, with other people, of about £3 million in today's money. So it wasn't the enslaved who got anything at abolition. And that just struck all of us as so unfair. And actually, Ali Gill is in Grenada, and that's the island where the Trevelyans owned 10 different plantations over the years. So through talking to Ali Gill and other people in the reparations movement in Grenada, we decided that it was important for us to apologise for the actions of our ancestors, that you could do that morally and philosophically. And people in the Caribbean said, you can set an example. So I think, and we also made donations towards education in Grenada and have set up a family charity, so it's ongoing. So I think the point is, if a family can apologise and pay reparations, so can the king. The royal family was involved through the Royal African Company in the actual trade of Africans at the beginning of the slave trade. The king is both head of the Commonwealth, Supreme Governor of the Church of England. He's a constitutional monarch, so he can't run ahead of the government of the day too far. But there's going to be an election this year. The Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting is in October. He's been deepening his understanding of the legacies of slavery for almost 2 years now, so one would expect that he would do something.
That might be the moment at Chogham later in the year. I mean, Ben, many campaigners are saying the rhetoric isn't enough now. There needs to be an apology.
Britain hasn't apologised for anything properly. We were the victors in the Second World War, and ever since, it's taken us decades to catch up with our colonial past. It wasn't taught in schools properly until recently, still not on major parts of the curriculum. And we haven't had a moment like Germany had after the 1945 war, where it had to examine itself. We've never had this we've never hit a wall. I mean, our involvement in slavery and our involvement in the colonies ended up with us asking people from the West Indies who were British to come here and work here and help us recover after the war. These people were then subjected to the Windrush scandal decades later because they hadn't been, their records hadn't been taken, they hadn't been given British passports, their British Dominion status hadn't come to British citizenship. It's amazing, as your guest said from Grenada, that we haven't apologised for this. It should have been apologised for decades ago. And we're still catching up with every single scandal, every single part of our legacy. We have to have these debates. Should we apologise? Will the king apologise? The last one that I reported on myself a bit was the Mau Mau. We may have killed up to 100,000 people in the Mau Mau rebellion in Kenya. They sued for reparations and for compensation. And I don't think we apologised. I think we expressed regret over what happened. I mean, it needs a full apology.
I've got 30 seconds, but Laura, I mean, language is so important. Why do you think, I mean, you've done it, your family have, you've paid some form of compensation, reparations. Why do you think that apology hasn't come yet?
From the king, I think, well, it's just very straightforward. The government of the day at this moment has set its face against reparations. As Ben said, the language is always, we regret that slavery happened. And the answer is that if you apologise, the fear, obviously, in Whitehall and in Buckingham Palace is that then you open yourself up to a financial claim for reparations. So by expressing regret, you thread the needle, you say that, you know, something bad happened, but you don't go as far as apologising. So I think it's the fear of financial demands that would follow.
Laura, Ben, thank you, and do stay with us because this is The World with me, Yalda Hakim, coming up next. Trump's trouble with musicians, why the US president is facing demands to stop playing the music of another artist at his rallies. Stay with us for that.
I think that when we're looking across history, that empires are a fundamental part of our history. They were the fundamental part of world order. And if we're thinking about this within the wider context, King George III himself in the 1750s argued for the abolition of slavery. He argued that it was immoral. We know that Queen Victoria, for example, was incredibly kind to the Muslim community in the United Kingdom. And so ultimately, when we're looking through our history, it's very difficult to actually make these specific arguments for who should be paying reparations. I'm half Moroccan. Should the Moroccan kingdom be paying reparations to Cornish people for the Barbary slave trade? It's very difficult to actually pin down where these arguments should be lying and actually where these reparations or these apologies should be kept.
King Charles, this is the man who is obviously head of state, head of the Church of England, and ultimately decided to commission the first monarch to commission a report into the royal family's links into the slave trade. So this is a man who was very much centred around equality, right? So this is a good thing. In terms of who should pay it, that's ultimately your point. Well, it starts with King Charles, let's just be clear. The monarchy advocated and benefited from the slave trade. We're talking 3.4 million people that were transported from the African continent into the Americas and the Caribbean, 450,000 of which died during the process. Monarchy advocated and benefited from that. We also have the fact that the slave owners were compensated, so people like you, people like me, paid as taxpayers for the slave owners' declaration or agreement that was sorted out 400 years ago. In the past.
King Charles is not personally responsible. Nobody today is personally responsible for the slave trade. And I hear your point, and I hear the fact that racism still exists today, and many of the institutional difficulties that we see today stem from these historical grievances.
Yes, thank you.
However, nobody today caused the slave trade.
Yeah.
Nobody alive today financially benefits from the slave trade today. And so I think it's incredibly, I think, disingenuous to actually look at these arguments and actually say that we can trace back exactly who benefited, where benefited.
But we can.
No, we cannot.
This week, Sinead O'Connor's estate demanded that Donald Trump stop using her songs at rallies. She's one of a long list of musicians to have expressed their anger. It got me thinking about the importance of a candidate's music choice. Have a look. Now, that last song, Hold On, I'm Coming by Sam and Dave, was used by Donald Trump on stage a few weeks ago. That's even though the owners have threatened legal action, so have a number of other artists, including Rihanna and Adele. But, Ben, I mean, some of Donald Trump's choices, they're quite fun at a rally.
You never think that he'd choose YMCA. I don't know why he would choose that song. It's a gay anthem.
It's from his New York nightclubbing days.
I mean, who knew? I mean, it's extraordinary that he'd be using that. And I know that the Rolling Stones didn't want him to.
No, that's right. Yes.
As well, but it's very strange when you go to these rallies the Trump rallies. I went to some in 2015, 2016. he does get people fired up, and he does do this weird dance where he waves his small hands around, and it seems to get the crowd going.
I think that if Taylor Swift were to allow Joe Biden to use her songs, that Donald Trump would absolutely erupt in fury. Just imagine that. And remember, she did endorse Biden in 2020, so nothing's impossible.
No, that's very true. Laura, Ben, thank you so much for staying with me this evening, and thank you so much for being with us. That's all for the programme tonight. Thanks for watching. We're back at 9 p.m. tomorrow. News at 10 is next. Good night.